Hi, welcome to Fantastic Fat Loss Physiology Part 2. My name's Gavin. I'll be going through the presentation with you today. I'm the Chief Inspiration Coach at ptcoach.co, a global master trainer for the Life Fitness Academy for the last 16 years, and that's given me the chance to present in over 40 countries for them. I'm the Education Director at Life Fitness Australia and also a guest coach at the Australian Institute of Fitness. A lot of people have said, why this topic area? And, fantastic fat loss physiology, the physiology of fat loss. There's been a lot done here and we understand. The thing is that a lot of people study this area in individual niches, but they don't put it all together as one big model. What we're basically looking at here is going beyond the energy in, energy out equation. And I mentioned this and discussed it in section 1 of this series. The goal here is to be able to identify the physiological factors that might limit somebody's ability to achieve fat loss, but also understanding the dynamic interaction that all these factors have. So today in part 2 of the series, I'm going to be looking at a few different topics. The first one being, what is the future approach to weight loss? Topic 2, a dynamic systems model and drivers of obesity. So we're going to look at how these interactions occur between this multivariate issue that we have with respect to our obesogenic environment at the moment. A dynamic systems model and the effectors of obesity. And these are things that can up and down regulate the things that drive us towards obesity. Of the effectors, there's this group called moderators. And the moderators, these are the ones that will physiological influence on the drivers. And the first 5 that we're looking at today are cortisol, leptin, ghrelin, insulin, and thyroid hormones. Now, as we go through the presentation, please feel free to email me any questions that you may have. The email is Gavin, G-A-V-I-N, at Gavin, G-A-V-I-N, Aquilina, A-Q-U-I-L-I-N-A.com. So, what is the future approach to weight loss? What it's called a dynamic mathematical systems model. And you'll hear people starting to talk about it a fair bit. I mean, anyone who's looking at the gut microbiota, they're definitely talking about a dynamic systems model. It's not common discussion at the present moment, but what we're looking at, this here is an image on the right-hand side of the Foresight report, a UK report that was looking at the factors that influence the obesogenic environment. You can see in the left column, it looks at many different things, not just your nutrition and your physiology, but it looks at psychology, sociology, the environment, economics. All these things can have an impact on a person's obesogenic environment. It's so important that we consider the broader picture, no matter which area we're looking at. Even if we're looking at insulin resistance, we've got to look at more than just insulin resistance, as we're going to see shortly. In a dynamic mathematical systems model, no one variable can explain the complete outcome. And that is the problem that we have with obesity, is, as discussed in part 1, we looked at energy in, energy out, but it isn't as simple as that. We've got to look at a broader picture to see what is influencing the drivers towards the energy in, energy out relationship there. Within a systems model, they have a thing called feedback loops. And what we're trying to do is capture as many of these feedback loops and how they're going to impact each other at any point in time. And this becomes the important part, that you should be able to put the data into this model at any point in time, and it will start to change its prescriptive approach for the individual that the information is being inputted for. If we have a look at some of the factors that we've identified as part of my master's thesis, some of them are displayed on the board here, on the screen here. And what we have to do is we have to make sense of these. Where do they all fit? Where do they, and how do they all impact each other? And so the model that we came up with here is one where we have the drivers. We have distal drivers, medial drivers, and proximal drivers. And these are all key linear forces that lead towards obesity. Sitting above them, we have the effectors. Now, the effectors, there's 3 different categories as well. There's mediators, moderators, and enablers. Once again, all driving towards obesity. But you'll also see that they have feed forward, but they also have feed backwards impacts as well. So if we look at the drivers of obesity, I've started off the closest ones to obesity because these are the ones that we really understand, and that is the proximal drivers, the things that are directly going to increase or decrease my body weight, whether I'm eating too much or whether I'm exercising too little, or doing the reverse so that I'm losing weight. So these are our proximal drivers, and people believe that these are very volitional. They're all of our own choice, and some of them are, but some of these are very much driven by other factors. If we then start to look at some of the other factors that can have an impact, we have the medial drivers, and these form part of the individual's obesogenic environment, the environment that is going to impact their appetite, impact their ability to exercise, impact their desire to exercise. So it has a significant impact on the environment around them and what is going to be the optimal, the outcome for that individual. We then go one step further away again, and we go to the distal drivers. And this is when we look at your cultural and your sociological, your political, your economic. This here, I believe, is an amazing graph, and it simply looks at mean body mass index on the y-axis, and on the x-axis, it looks at the per capita GDP, so how much each individual is worth within a country. And you'll see that as we go up, as the GDP goes up within countries, so does the rate of obesity. There's a very interesting point at around the $30,000 per individual, so each person is worth $30,000 in a country, where there starts to be a differentiation. And we see here that we've got the countries USA, New Zealand, the US, Australia, Canada, and Ireland. They are all clustered together. You find that Germany, Finland, Italy, Sweden, Denmark, Switzerland, Norway, they're all clustered together. The differentiation here could be food habits within their particular environment. So the GDP is meaning they're becoming more obese, but their food habits could be different between this cluster of countries and this cluster. What really exemplifies this is the difference in food habits when we look at somewhere like Japan and Singapore. Significantly lower or healthy BMI in relationship to the other two clusters we see. But if we then go beyond the drivers, and then we have a look at the effectors, the things that are going to up or down regulate obesity, we have the three different categories. We have mediators, okay, the mediators being the environment or society that they are living within. The moderators, these are the genetic and physiological markers, the things that can have an impact upon the proximal, medial, and distal drivers down the bottom here. Then finally, the enablers, and this is a person's personal circumstances, things that will impact their obesogenic environment as a result of personal circumstance there. The one that we're going to focus on, though, we're going to focus on this middle one, the moderators, the things that we can measure and ideally have some sort of interaction or input with to create a change. So if we have a look at the influence of the physiological moderators on weight control, the ones we're focusing on there being the cortisol, etc. The degree of response to the effectors is individual. To some there may be no response, but to some there may be a mild response, but some even a dramatic response. So this is where we start to look at the genetic component and what impact does genetics have here. If we have a look, the first one that we're going to discuss today is going to be cortisol. Now, with respect to cortisol, what do we know? We know that it is a significantly associated with obesity. Why is it associated with obesity? Well, cortisol, traditionally, it's been a stress hormone. It's been part of the adrenaline, the corticotropin releasing hormone, and cortisol are all part of the fight and flight response that we have. Now, the intention of cortisol, it's so associated with a negative effect. It's supposed to be a positive hormone, and it's supposed to help us stay alive if there's a lion or a tiger out there. It also can have, when available in the right quantities, it can have a positive influence on our immune system as well. The problem that we have in modern society is that we have this chronic low-grade life stress. We have the traffic that we're driving to work in. We have the accounts, the bills, the boss. All these things are a constant stress in our life, which result in this chronic long-term exposure to cortisol. What problem does that have? Well, When we have a high cortisol level, it promotes the liver to increase its glucose secretion because cortisol is a fight or flight hormone, and it says, you know what, we need this carbohydrate, we need this immediate and powerful fuel. So if we have this constant level of secretion of glucose by the liver, it means insulin has to be released as well. And we know that when insulin levels are high, fat is stored. So we start becoming more of a fat storing machine in this stressed environment. We also know that it's been suggested that cortisol, it may impact the hypothalamus directly, and it may stimulate an individual to eat food that's high in fat or sugar. Now, we know that the goal of this high or fat sugary food drive is to activate the limbic dopamine system, a reward system that helps us deal with the compact or the impact of these stress hormones called glucocorticoids. And the high fat sugar foods and the activation of the limbic dopamine system, it helps decrease the stress or anxiety that we're actually experiencing. Quite often people will measure cortisol in the blood, and it is one of the best indicators of cortisol levels, but there is also HSD, which is a fat storage enzyme, which is present in a lot of our cells, and even in higher quantities around the abdominal region. And so therefore, when we have cortisol release, we also have a greater amount of fat deposition around the abdominal region, and knowing that abdominal fat also has a significant impact on liver and leading towards things such as insulin resistance for us there. So with respect to cortisol, there is definitely a problem when it comes to nutrition and possible excess energy intake, but there's an increased rate of lipogenesis that we get from cortisol as well. A nice little summary slide here or picture where it says, well, we get an increase in stress, you get an increase in cortisol. And I'm going to talk about leptin sensitivity a little bit in relation to this. If we have a decrease in leptin sensitivity, it means we get hungrier. If we get hungrier and we're producing more insulin, we have an increased amount of fat storage. Increased fat storage means that your weight is going to go up. And we're going to talk about this. I'm going to talk about the interrelationship of several of these hormones in a little bit. If we look at leptin and ghrelin, leptin, it's basically a longer-term satiety hormone, and it responds to the degree of body weight or body fat that we're carrying at any particular time. Leptin itself, it's part of the hunger system, okay, but it's also part of the reward system as well, that limbic dopamine system where we have that reward within the body. Now, what leptin does, it basically is secreted by your fat cells. And the way it works in an ideal world is when we increase the size of or amount of fat that we carry in the body, the amount of leptin goes up. The amount of leptin goes up and it says, you know what? It's a satiety signal, and it says, you've got enough food. You've had enough food. You're carrying enough fat. You don't need to keep on eating any more. So increased body weight should result in increased leptin production. And loss of body weight means that leptin levels go down. Now, this is in an ideal world, the way that leptin would work for us. But what we know is there is the ability for the body to become leptin resistant. Now, with respect to leptin resistance, this means that your body fat levels are going up, leptin is being produced at a high level, but the body then starts to become resistant to it. Okay, the hypothalamus in the brain there, it becomes resistant to the signal leptin is saying. So the fat cells are saying, you know what, you've had enough food, you're full. But because there's so much leptin being produced, the body becomes immune to its impact. So the leptin is trying to say to the brain, look, we've got enough, but the brain becomes resistant to the message that is sending to it. And as a result, the hunger system and the reward system is not satisfied, and it can lead to chronic overeating as a result. It's also been proposed, just as we talk about leptin sensitivity or leptin resistance, that leptin can also have an impact upon insulin sensitivity, which we're going to discuss a little bit later there. So leptin in an ideal world should suppress appetite as we put on weight, and then as we lose weight, it should also have a positive impact upon helping us sustain a certain body weight. But what we know is that one of the problems, as discussed in section 1, is that if I've never been obese, my fat cells, they will fill up. Okay, they'll fill up. Now, sorry, they'll be normal. Then, if I start to become obese, what happens? I then end up increasing the size of each fat cell, as we can see in the figure of the person on the left-hand side. So the size of those fat cells fill up. Then when they start to fill up, the body produces more fat cells. So we have a greater number of fat cells being produced. So we have this hyperplasic response. But then what happens is we decide we want to lose weight. So normal means that my leptin levels are okay. I become obese. High level of leptin production should occur at this point in a person who is functioning normally there. So there's a high level of leptin production which says, you know what, you don't need to eat any more food. But the problem, and this is as far as weight regain, so after losing weight, what happens is we start to lose the weight, but we have more fat cells now. We lose weight, the fat cells shrink in size. But the problem is the fat cells don't want to be starved. So now what's happened is I have lost weight, I have more fat cells, so therefore for me to get to my previous body weight, I would have to shrink each fat cell further than when I wasn't obese at all. The problem that this creates is that the fat cells, they want to be sitting at around this 0.6 micrograms per cell. But for me to get back to my previous non-obese weight, I have to shrink more fat cells even further. What this does, this results in a high level of, a decreased level of leptin being released, and so a high drive towards appetite being increased and ghrelin being present in the body, which means that leptin, and one of the problems with leptin is that it is actually protecting us. It is protecting us from losing too much weight. But the problem is it becomes overprotective. So our set point now, where we might have been 80 kilograms before, it might now be at 85 or 88 kilograms, because that is where the body feels that the fat cells are shrinking too low. This is discussed in section 1 or part 1 of the series in more depth also. Ghrelin. Ghrelin is an appetite hormone. Now, leptin being a more chronic appetite hormone, ghrelin is a more acute response hormone. So basically, if the stomach is empty, we have a high amount of ghrelin present, which means we've got an increase in appetite. If the stomach is full, the distension of the stomach wall basically sends a neural signal to say to the body to stop producing ghrelin and decrease appetite. And so ghrelin itself is a hormone that helps us from starving to death or drives us towards wanting to increase energy intake and finding more food. Ghrelin levels, they also increase in response to increased glucocorticoid levels and stress, so increase stress levels, the fight or flight response. So the ghrelin levels will increase at this point. What ghrelin will also promote? It will promote gluconeogenesis. So what ghrelin is saying is you haven't got food present in your system, so let's start to produce food from other sources. And so actually, if food is not present, gluconeogenesis is a form of energy production that utilizes protein, amongst other products, to start to produce energy. So problem with ghrelin is that it will lead to possibly excess energy intake and increased rates of lipogenesis or fat production, fat storage. Insulin. Insulin is probably the most widely discussed aspect of obesity. With respect to insulin, insulin we know is a hormone that is required to take the carbohydrates and deposit it into the cells there. What we know though is that in obese populations, the obesity is linked to insulin resistance. And what that simply means is that the cells become resistant to the impact of insulin to open them up to allow the glucose to travel inside. So what does this result? It results in an increased glucose production by the liver and elevated blood insulin levels. Now, when insulin is present in the bloodstream, fats are stored. So the problem we have is we have high blood insulin levels, which increased in greater fat deposition through there. But with respect to insulin, with respect to insulin resistance, if somebody's not controlling their blood glucose levels, the problem that we have is that insulin is in the bloodstream. So with insulin in the bloodstream, with insulin resistance, we have high blood glucose levels. Why? Because the glucose can't get into the cells. We have high insulin levels because the pancreas is having to put out more insulin because of this resistance. We have high blood glucose, we have high insulin, but the problem is we still have hungry cells. So somebody's appetite is still elevated. Where traditionally in a person whose body is working normally, if they have high insulin levels, their appetite is ameliorated. It's not high, it's satiated. They don't feel hungry anymore. But the problem is in somebody who is insulin resistant, the insulin isn't opening the cells, it isn't getting the carbohydrate in, and so it's not satisfying the appetite of the cells. So therefore their hunger is then in overdrive as well. And we're going to look at a relationship of insulin in relation to leptin and also cortisol in a short while. We then head to the thyroid hormones. With respect to the thyroid hormones, we know that there is two primary ones that have quite often been studied, and those hormones being T4 and T3. Now, T3 is the most active of these. Now, what does the thyroid do? For our intents and purposes, the thyroid itself, it drives our metabolism. And so what we need the thyroid to be working effectively, to keep our metabolism working effectively through there. Now, what people used to do is they used to test for thyroid T4 and T3, but they didn't test for what is really important, which is called reverse T3. And this is the third most common of your thyroid hormones. With respect to reverse T3, or the ratio of T3 to reverse T3, it is a critical measure to be done to determine whether the thyroid is working properly and if it's having a negative impact upon our body and our body weight. Basically, when you go in and we go into a caloric restricted diet, what that does is that will result in a weight plateau. Why does it result in a weight plateau? It's because it results in an increase in reverse T3. Now, what reverse T3 does, it blocks the receptor sites for T3. Now, T3 wants to stimulate our metabolism. Reverse T3 says, well, wait up, you're on a calorie-restricted diet. This can be dangerous. And so it blocks the receptor sites for T3, which results in reduced levels of active thyroid hormones or suppressed metabolism. What this is called, it's called reverse T3 dominance. So it is so important that we understand that, yes, we've got your T4 and T3 hormones, which are extremely important, but the ratio of T3 to reverse T3 is a critical measurement that we have to take to understand what is happening with respect to your thyroid hormone there. So, if we look at how all of this combines, and this becomes an interesting relationship. If we then look at the relationship of cortisol, okay, with respect to cortisol, it makes weight loss difficult, and that is a completely understood relationship there. It makes weight loss difficult, but some believe that the mechanism, as far as why does it make weight loss difficult, that it's not actually the cortisol itself, but it's actually the cortisol. Cortisol, it can lead to leptin resistance. Because what happens is when you've got elevated cortisol, it means you've got more leptin that is being secreted. Now, if I've got more leptin that's being secreted, this can then lead to leptin resistance. So cortisol leads to increased leptin being released. It can lead to leptin resistance. Now, leptin resistance, it can lead to the pancreatic beta cell leptin resistance. So leptin is no longer regulating insulin, which becomes a really important part. So leptin has an impact on insulin and its release and insulin sensitivity. So I've got high cortisol, which leads to high leptin, which leads to leptin resistance. Now leptin, it regulates insulin. Now if leptin is resistant, then insulin is not being effectively modulated as well. So what does this lead to? Well, it leads to the relationship of insulin resistance, which is high glucose and high insulin secretion. So now what happens is leptin resistance means my appetite is high. It means my limbic dopamine system is not being satisfied, so my reward circuit's not being satisfied, so I want to eat more. I've got leptin resistance. I've also got insulin resistance, so I'm eating more. Insulin is not doing its job effectively, so I've got more glucose and carbohydrate floating around in the bloodstream, which is then driving even further insulin secretion. What can then happen is you can then end up with hypothalamic leptin resistance as well. This then also takes it into another step further where the brain is not even recognizing leptin at the correct levels. So we've got this whole melee, and this is where I talk about a dynamic systems model. But if we put another level in here as well, cortisol, leptin resistance, insulin resistance. But when you've got leptin resistance, it stimulates reverse T3. Now remember, reverse T3 suppresses your metabolic rate. So you've got this person whose appetite is in overdrive, who's not processing energy properly, who because of insulin resistance is wanting to store fat and is wanting to suppress their metabolism. A dynamic systems model is such an important model for us to consider in treatment of obesity. It is so important for us not just to look at one factor, but to look at many factors. Now, we have further parts that I'm going to discuss in Series 3 of this webinar series. And in Series 3, we start to talk about a factor, which is the gut microbiome, and how important it is. If people look at thyroid and trying to treat thyroid, really what they say is you should be looking at your gut microbiota and what impact it's having on driving the thyroid hormone. So very important. So as a summary, what is the future approach to weight loss? Well, it's going to be a dynamic mathematical systems model, and it has to be adapted to achieve successful weight loss. A dynamic system model and drivers of obesity. Well, as we can see, there's drivers of obesity that can exert a direct effect, for example, increased appetite, or indirect government policy on our obesogenic environment. But it's not as simple as a matter of individual willpower. What we know and what we've looked at here is that there's factors that can up or down regulate the factors that drive obesity. So what's driving my appetite? And that relationship of cortisol, insulin, leptin, and we left ghrelin out, but ghrelin as well, all will drive that the obesity of an individual. It's the influence of the physiological markers. Well, it's a dynamic systems model, and feedback loops exist between these physiological variables, and it's extremely complicated as previously discussed. But as said, cortisol has a significant impact upon the proximal drivers of obesity and other physiological moderators. Leptin, it's a master hormone impacting the proximal drivers of obesity, but it's strongly influenced by cortisol, insulin, and leptin, and it actually can influence them as well, as discussed there. Ghrelin has an impact. Insulin, it has an impact on the proximal drivers. It's influenced by cortisol, and it's impacted by leptin there as well. Then you've got the thyroid hormones. They have a significant impact on metabolic rate. Quite often there's been the wrong type of testing done, and reverse T3 dominance becomes important. And as looked at previously there, if I end up leptin resistant, that will then promote a greater amount of T3 dominance, reverse T3 dominance, which then will suppress our metabolic rate even further. I hope you've enjoyed this section of the fantastic physiology for fat loss. If you do have any questions, please email me at gavin@gavinakwilina.com, and I'll answer those questions, and I'll post most of the answers back at gavakwilina on Facebook. Please feel free to join me for part 3 of the Fantastic Fat Loss Physiology series there. What we're going to look at is the final 5 physiological factors that limit your client's weight loss. We're going to be looking at metabolic rate, metaflammation and C-reactive protein, abnormal gut microbiome, and leaky gut. And for mine, these two here, metaflammation and abnormal gut microbiome, are probably the 2 greatest areas of investigation that we have to put forward when it comes to the current obesogenic issue that we have in the world. Gene variations, and we'll also be looking at phthalates. We're then also going to look and discuss just a high overview of what some of the testing and possible treatments of these 10 physiological factors for optimal weight loss could be. So to register, you can go to gumroad.com/L/FF3 and use the code FF3 to receive the webinar series for free. Thanks so much for joining me on this part 2 of Fantastic Fat Loss Physiology. I hope you enjoyed it and look forward to hearing from you soon. If you enjoy this, please feel free to go to Gavak Wallina on Facebook and just write a post and just let people know that they have to come on board and have a bit of a listen to what we've been discussing through this Fantastic Fat Loss Physiology series. Thanks so much and look forward to hearing from or talking to you soon.